This is a wall in our house that is in bad need of a shelf. Only the problem is that the floors where the shelf's going to go are totally not level. You can see there's like an 1.5 inch drop going one way, and in the other direction the floors are also not level. So this video is for anyone who's got an old house and wants to build a shelf but doesn't want the shelf to be unlevel. Now, I've done this a few other ways in this house. One way I've done it is to build a level platform and then put a shelf on top of it, and that works pretty well. I've also just built some furniture and then shimmed it up underneath, and you can totally do that too. I'm just not crazy about shims. They kind of slip out and don't always look really great. So in this method, I'm using the wall as the rear anchor. Alright, so this is a shelf for boxes, and like I said, it's not going to be traditional, sort of traditional shelf. Instead, it utilizes these two support posts in the front. So that's kind of the method. Now this sketch is a little bit different than what I ended up building, but you'll get the gist. These support posts in front sort of become your front bracing for the shelf, and then the shelf relies on strips along the wall which are perfectly level. Alright, so here's your list of stuff you need. 2 sheets of plywood is what I use. That'll depend on your shelf. Some pine strips that go on the wall, pine supports, a saw, sander or sandpaper, a level, power drill. 2 power drills is even better. A couple bar clamps are going to be essential. Wood glue, wood screws, and a brad nailer if you have one. If you don't, just some brad nails and a hammer is just fine. Now, you don't necessarily need this straight edge guide. This is just a cutting guide I use when I use my circular saw to cut plywood. You can totally just cut it by eye and it'll end up straight. As long as you cut slowly, you're not going to get tear out on your plywood. It's just really key to cut slow. If you move that saw quickly, you'll just get much more tear out. Alright, so I cut my shelves. You can see they're big ones. And after cutting them, all 6 of them, I just sanded them up to get a smooth face, and especially that front edge nice and smooth. And then after that, I just cut the pine strips. These are 2-inch wide strips, and I cut them the full rear length of the shelf. So however long your shelves are, just cut your strips that length. The shelves are going to rest on the strips. In my case, these were just 48 inches, which is the same width as the sheet of plywood. Okay, let's return to the problem, which is this floor that's not level. This way in particular, it's off by quite a bit, but it's also not level in this direction. So it's really a test case for building a shelf that is level. I started out by anchoring the strips to the wall exactly where I wanted the shelf, and like with everything in this project, I just pre-drilled. Pre-drilling everything is the way to go in a project like this. You won't get any splitting, and also make sure that you are hitting your studs with your anchor screws. You want the rear part of this shelf to be really solid. A lot of the weight of the shelf is going to be held by this rear section. So once I got one in place, I just continued to go on up the wall, measuring and level as I went. My shelves have 13 inches of vertical shelf space between them. That means that these strips are 13 3/4 inches between them. That extra 3/4 is just the width of my plywood. And after getting everything anchored to the wall, I got my posts together. Now these are some kind of nice 2x2 posts that I picked up in my hardware store. You don't necessarily need to use 2x2 posts like this. I just thought they looked pretty cool. You could use thinner 3/4 inch boards if you wanted to. Now I put the first board in place and used my bar clamp in this kind of cool way that actually allows you to ratchet the shelf up and down. It's kind of a nice feature of bar clamps. You're not actually clamping the wood, but you're just raising it and lowering it. Next thing to do is to attach it to the side posts. Again, pre-drilling those posts and attaching the posts to the plywood using some pretty long, solid screws. Now the top section is kind of wiggly, so the next shelf I put in is the top one. And here I use my bar clamps to rest the front part of the shelf on the clamps. Obviously, if you had someone working with you on this job, you might not need the clamps because that person could hold the sheets of plywood, but it's definitely a one-person job. Alright, so the top shelf now is dialed in and nice and level, and once that's attached, you'll see that the whole rest of the shelf is kind of ready to go. The bottom is solid and squared up, and the top is leveled and squared up. So the next thing to do is actually pretty simple. It's just to follow your method and install the rest of the shelves using that bar clamp in the front to raise and lower the front of each shelf, just getting it exactly right. And this is a small thing but kind of nice. I was using a countersink drill bit on this project. That allows you to not only drill a hole but also drill a little concave cavity for the top of your screw. That way when you screw in to the wood, the screw top is nice and flush. Not necessary again, but pretty nice to have. I also used a longer drill bit when drilling in on the sides. That's just because you need the plywood to be drilled so you don't split it. Plywood just splits really easily if you screw into it. Now those shelves in the front are only held with screws, which is not very solid, so I glued and brad nailed on some extra supports. And my wood glue was kind of gooped up, so I had to use my finger here. Your wood glue is probably nicer than my wood glue, but anyway, I just glued these little supports underneath each shelf and use my brad nailer to nail them in place. You don't need a fancy brad nailer for this. You can just use little brad nails and a hammer, or you could even pre-drill these things and screw them in place. But they will give you a lot more strength on this shelf. Without extra supports, you would just be relying on those screws, which again is just not really the best way to go. I should say that this shelf is not super strong. You know, I wouldn't be storing like my heavy steel weight collection or anything like that. It's designed for yarn and fiber in these bins ultimately, so it's kind of a lightweight, light duty shelf. You could definitely beef it up with bigger supports than the ones that I'm using. Alright, so the shelf is built. Really just took me a couple hours to assemble it. It's not that big a job. And I didn't paint it or stain it or anything. I just went with the rough wood look. I did tune it up with a few hooks, but other than that, it's just ready to go. You could trim this out, finish it, or treat it in any way you wanted to. The best thing by far and what it's all about is having all these shelves be level. So at the end, I just went through and tested with the level just to kind of have that satisfaction of seeing that every shelf in this old unlevel house is dialed in and perfectly level. And then it was just a question of sliding some of those bins in place and kind of enjoying the shelf, which is a big upgrade in that space. Alright, thanks for checking out the video. Subscribe if you want to see more projects like this or other ones. I have a whole diverse array of things on my YouTube channel. I'm also on Instagram as Metaspencer, and I've got my hat out on Patreon. Thanks for checking it out, and I'll see you in the next build.